Okay, so as you'll recall, or not, we were talking about the Phillips curve. And if we can get our Phillips curve up here, that would be helpful. Let's see, where was it? There we go. Our Phillips curve was said to look like this, that there is a relationship in the data for 100 years in many, many different countries relating unemployment to inflation. The higher the level of inflation, the lower the level of unemployment. The lower the level of inflation, the higher the unemployment. And this was year after year and country after country, no matter how we measured it. But then, after 1972, this whole thing broke down. So this is starting in 72 and going forward, and you can see it's just all over the place. I think this is measured quarterly. That's why there's so many dots. Right? There hasn't been that many years, but it's just all over the place. And what we want to do is we want to understand why, first of all, that was such a strong relationship for so long, and secondly, why it disappeared. And then lastly, is there anything we can learn in general about when we're looking at data from that? Okay. So our basic story to explain this is our Phillips curve again. We have from the quantity theory of money and just general introspection about life that if we keep changing the money supply, eventually, maybe quickly, maybe in a while, that's going to affect prices, right? If all of a sudden, if in monopoly, there's very little money on the board, then all the houses, all the bids for properties, when you're auctioning them off to other players, they're going to go for low prices. If everyone's got thousands and thousands of dollars in monopoly, they're going to go for higher prices. It's the same thing. We got so much stuff, more or less. If there's loads and loads of euros chasing that stuff, things are going to go for high prices. But if everyone only has 2 euros, they're not going to spend as many euros to get the same stuff, right? So prices are going to be related to the amount of money that's out there, at least in the long run. So what that means is that after 1972, when we're off the gold standard, we can, if we want, use the money supply to try to affect unemployment. Right? Before 1972, the world more or less was on the gold standard, except in times of major war, in which case they had bigger problems than unemployment. Right? But unemployment wasn't an issue. But by and large, we were on the gold standard, which meant that we couldn't really change the money supply at will. In order to print more money, we needed to have more gold in the vault to back up the money. And if we didn't have that, well, it's a nice theory. We got this Phillips curve, but there's nothing you can really do about it. Right? So after 1972, we can start to say, hey, look, unemployment is a bad thing. Inflation is a bad thing. But, you know, inflation isn't great. But if we're at 2% inflation, if we could get to 3% inflation and get unemployment down, that might be worth doing. And then all of a sudden, for the first time, more or less in history, we can start to think about that trade-off. And everybody knew about the Phillips curve. It was really super famous at that point. So this was a trade-off that policymakers were genuinely thinking about. Okay. I will also remind you, let's see if we have that. We have this theory of the Phillips curve that we came up with, which is just like our theory of short-run aggregate supply. That is, people set their wage contracts or other input contracts, and these contracts are there for a period of time, the short run, right? And we set those contracts with an expectation of inflation. And if our inflation expectations are low, we set very low wage increases, and if we expect high inflation, we set higher wage increases. So it's exactly the same story that we had for short-run aggregate supply. It's just now, instead of looking at how much stuff we produce, we're looking at how many people are hired, or the unemployment rate. Okay. All right, so what happened? Okay, here's where we were. Okay, so now we can pick the level of inflation we want. And if this Phillips curve is a thing, policymakers argued, look, we know this Phillips curve is a thing because we have all this data. It's science. Like, you can have your theory is fine, but we have actual science. We looked at actual data, and if we change the rate of inflation, we are going to change unemployment. Okay? And so now we can think about, well, what level of unemployment do we want? Right? Okay, but what happened in the data was that things didn't work out that way, right? We changed inflation, but it didn't affect unemployment in a predictable way like this would happen. So what's going on? Well, if we think about our data, where did this data come from? It came from 100 years of actual practical experience, right? But it was actual practical experience in a particular policy environment. People were living their lives doing the best they could, setting their wages, negotiating with their bosses negotiating with workers, all of that stuff was happening given a certain policy environment. And so when people were negotiating that stuff, they took that policy environment into account. And in particular, everybody knew that the world was on the gold standard. This was like advertised everywhere. It was a thing, right? We have William Jennings Bryan trying to be president by saying we should get rid of the gold standard. So this is a thing that people were aware of. And so they know if we're on the gold standard that the central bank or the policymakers can't change the rate of inflation. Inflation might be high or might be low, just depending on whether output is higher than normal, less than normal, whether everything is behaving in a predictable way, or were some surprises coming up. Did we have like a gold rush? All of a sudden gold came into the economy. Do we have, was oil discovered, or was there a war? There's all kinds of things that are unexpected. So you don't know what inflation is going to be in the next year. But one thing that you do know is that the policymakers can't be trying to manipulate inflation to deal with anything because they're on the gold standard. So this was not a thing when you were trying to guess what the future was back in those days, was it going to be, you didn't have to try to guess what people were going to do with the money supply. That wasn't a thing that you had to worry about. You had to worry about, is there going to be a war? Is there going to be a recession? Is there going to be a bank panic? Lots to worry about. But what the policymakers were going to do with inflation wasn't one of them. And so you formed your expectations of inflation based on all that other stuff, and then you did your wage negotiations. Okay. And so with that, based on all that other stuff, you'd have some expectations of inflation, and that would give you a particular short-run Phillips curve. And it could be, just by random chance, that the inflation was higher than you expected, in which case unemployment would be lower than expected. It could be just by random chance, then you predicted wrong, inflation was less than expected, and therefore unemployment was higher than expected. But all of this was based on your inflation expectations, and those expectations didn't involve guessing what policymakers were going to do. However, after 1972, we have the central bank has this power to control the inflation rate. Maybe not quite directly, but pretty quickly. If they keep changing the money supply, they can affect the inflation rate. And now they know about the Phillips curve, as does the entire world. And we know that they are going to be thinking about what level of unemployment should we have. Right? And so now, since they can pick the inflation rate, when we are thinking what inflation do we expect, we still have to worry about the wars and the bank panics and the booms and the busts and the oil discoveries and all of that. But we also have to worry about how much inflation do these guys want to give us. So we have to be predicting policy as well as predicting the world when we're deciding our inflation expectations. Okay. And so if the central bank has this incentive to try to lower unemployment, which we said they did, if they're trying to lower unemployment, that means they're going to give us more inflation. Which means that when we're negotiating our contracts, we should expect more inflation, which means this curve is going to shift up. So as we go from the gold standard to fiat money, we're going to have a shift upward in this curve because people are going to be expecting policymakers to try to exploit this relationship. And you have to predict policymakers as well now, otherwise you do badly in the market. And so now we had this strong empirical relationship that lasted for 100 years, but it was 100 years in one particular policy environment. And now that policy environment has broken down. We've gone off the gold standard. Now, for the first time, we can exploit this relationship. But just as we can exploit the relationship disappears. Okay. And this is because our Phillips curves start to shift. They were never shifting before. Right? So since they weren't shifting, we could just move along it. We would just move along it. But now, as we're trying to guess what policymakers are doing, we are shifting that Phillips curve up and down, and it's no longer a stable relationship. This thing that for 100 years was stable no longer is the moment we try to exploit it. Okay? Now this is a specific example of a general phenomenon. And this general phenomenon is the Lucas critique. This is named after Robert E. Lucas, Jr. So that's Lucas. He wins the Nobel Prize. And we all knew he would. Like, it was one of those, like, normally economists get together before the prize. Who do you think is going to get who? But Lucas was obvious. Like, if he could just avoid dying, he was going to get the prize. He's like really, really genuinely good. But here he has a critique. It's normally talked about as a critique of empirical macroeconomics, but in fact it applies to economics more generally, or in fact any social science more generally. And so here's how it works. In general, when we're looking at data, we're looking at what actually happened to the best we can measure it, which is always imperfect and messy and all of that, right? And this data came from real people making real decisions in the real world, hopefully, more or less. And so when they were doing that, there was a certain policy environment that was in place. In our particular example, it was the gold standard. But it's true of anything, right? If you have, you want to think about changing insurance, right? People were making their insurance decisions given particular policies in place. And so whatever the country's insurance policies are, those are going to affect people's decisions. Okay. So whatever those policies were affect how people live their lives. And so those policies that are in place during that data generating process, they affect the data itself because we're measuring people's behavior. Policies affect people's behavior. And so when we're looking at how people behave, when we're looking at the data, it is including in the background all of the policies that were in place during that time. Right? Now, suppose we change our policies. In this case, we go off the gold standard. Right? We change our policies, and now we want to use this empirical relationship. Right? Why do we look at all this data? So that we could learn something that we could use. We look at the data, we see how people behave, and then we say, look, that's how people behave. Let's use this to make the world a better place, whatever our definition of better place is. Unemployment lower in our particular case here. Right, so we're going to try to use this empirical relationship that we have to try to make the world a better place. So we're going to change our policies in some way to try to make use of that empirical relationship. But of course, that empirical relationship depended on people's behavior, which depended on the policies that were there in the first place. So when we change our policies, we may change people's behavior, maybe a little bit, maybe dramatically. Okay? And so this, in extreme cases, can cause the empirical relationship to just disappear. Phillips curve being sort of the prime example of this thing. When we started trying to exploit the relationship, as soon as we did, the whole relationship disappeared, even though it was a really strong one beforehand. But in general, for anything, as you start changing the policies, you're changing the environment that people are living in, they're going to change their behavior. Right? And maybe that'll affect things a lot, maybe it'll affect it a little, but we've seen that it can affect it a lot. And so you need to take this into account. So how do you do that? Well, the trouble is, like any time you're looking at data, you're looking at historical stuff that involved the policies that were going on at that time, right? And so you can't just go on data. Like you want to say, like physicists, I don't care about your opinion. I'm going to drop this rock and we're going to see how fast it falls, and that's just how rocks fall, and we're good to go, right? But with social sciences, when you're dealing with humans, or to a lesser extent, but also true, animals, if you're dealing with people, if people are things that have brains of their own, it's not like dropping rocks, right? As you change the environment that it's in, they are going to to change their behavior. Right? Anyone who's ever played online shooters against other people knows that it's very different than playing against bots. When you play against bots, you learn the rules to kill the guy, you're good to go. When you're playing against human, you learn the rules, you kill the guy, and he changes his behavior and he shoots you. Right? This is how it works. It's the same thing here. They're not necessarily out to shoot you here, although they might be, you don't know. But as you change the environment that people are working in, they're going to change their behavior. And so you cannot reliably use empirical measurements, no matter how good they are, to predict what people are going to do, to predict how you can't necessarily exploit them, make use of them in a predictable, useful way. So what do? You say, okay, well, social science is out the door, we can't do anything. It's a bit of a theme. Like, when we're dealing with people, we're never going to have a full handle on everything. We are not. Right? The world is too complicated. It is not like dropping the rocks where we can fully understand how acceleration works and all of that. We are always going to be in a world of mystery. We are not going to know everything, but we can do better. Right? And how can we do better? We can say, well, we have an empirical relationship. It is not good enough just to say that unemployment and inflation are related in a strong way, because you don't know why that is, and so you don't know whether that's going to persist if you try to use that relationship to make the world a better place. And so you have to also try to figure out why. Why are people making the decisions they're doing? How do those decisions affect the data? Right? So for empirical work to be useful, it sounds all sciencey and we have 8 decimal places and all that, but for it to be useful, it has to go hand in hand with understanding why people are doing what they're doing. Right? And only then can you hope to get a better handle on what's going to happen if you change the policy. Because if you know why people are making their decisions, then you can not only look at the data before, but you can say, now that I know how you're making your decision, or some facsimile of that, now when I change the policy, I have some prediction of how you're going to change your behavior. And then it can be useful. Right? Now you don't want to just have theory on its own, because I can make up any old theory and it can be as goofy as you like. We really do want to check to see whether our theories match reality in any way, but you have to go hand in hand, otherwise you can be very, very badly misled. This is the Lucas critique. Okay? You will always see it attached to macroeconomics, but it applies to anything involving units with brains, right? It can be predicting wolves, it can be predicting humans, it can be predicting micro stories, it can be predicting macro stories. If you change the policy environment, it's going to change people's behavior. So you have to understand how that behavior is likely to change before you make your policy predictions. Okay? Obviously, you'll never do that perfectly, but to the extent you can do it well, that's the thing. Okay, so that's our thing. But this is economics, and economics, our big claim to fame, or what makes economics, in my personal opinion, others disagree, is the concept of equilibrium. That it's not well enough to say, okay, people are going to change their expectations. In what way are they likely to change their expectations? So what's going to happen in this environment? And we can talk a little bit about equilibrium here. We'll talk more about this next year, for those of you who are coming to intermediate macro. But to do that, to talk about equilibrium, we need to add theory to this empirical relationship, right? And we need to think about, how do people form their expectations? As we said, if the government or the central bank is starting to exploit this relationship, we're going to take that into account. Well, how? How do we do that? How do we take that into account? What do we do? And so we want to look for some kind of equilibrium in this. Okay. So this is called the Barrow-Gordon model, after Mr. Barrow and Mr. Gordon, as you might imagine. And we're going to do a very, very brief introduction to it, but just to give you an idea what's going on with this stuff. Okay. So we're going to assume, and this is just pulling it out of the air, that the central bank has goals. They're not just randomly doing stuff. They want to do something with their policy. And we're going to think that they want to do 2 things. They want to get inflation as close to some target level of inflation as possible, and they're going to want to get unemployment as close to some target level of unemployment as possible. So they have these two goals, an inflation target and unemployment target, and if the world was perfect, they would just get on those targets and it would be a perfect world for them. Okay. Now we had a tutorial, right, where we were trying to think about what would be the ideal inflation rate, what would be the ideal unemployment rate, whatever they are. Maybe they're zero if you're into that kind of thing, but whatever they are. Okay. And we're going to assume, and this is I don't know, you could see whether you buy this or not, but the farther you are away from the target, the more you care about it. So if you're really, 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 really close to your inflation target, but way off on the unemployment target, you care a lot about the unemployment problem and not so much about your tiny, tiny, itty-bitty inflation problem. And this is kind of like diminishing marginal rate of substitution. It's the same sort of thing. Big deviations from your target really matter to you as a central bank, and small deviations, not so much. Okay. And here's the bit that's potentially problematic, is that we are going to suppose that the target unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. Okay. Natural rate of unemployment, again, is just the normal level of unemployment. It seems like to people that haven't taken economics, that seems quite normal. First of all, this idea of a natural rate of unemployment is repugnant to humans, not to economists, obviously, but to actual human beings. It's kind of disgusting, but we're good with it, right? We're all economists here. We're good with it. We've sold our soul to the dark side. Yeah, good. But we want it to be less. So you can think, for example, to tell this story, that in a particular economy there is this normal frictional level of unemployment, and there's also some structural unemployment, right? And that structural unemployment is because of a mismatch of skills with industry, and we would ideally like to get rid of that structural unemployment as well. Maybe we would like to get rid of some of the frictional unemployment as well, but our story here is that our target level of unemployment is less than the natural rate. This is what makes the model go. Personally, I don't find this weird, but I can see that a reasonable person could very easily find this weird. So you decide for yourself whether you find it weird or not. Okay. Okay. And so we can ask a question then. Given that this is the case, is it possible for the central bank to achieve its targets? Right? It controls the rate of inflation, we're going to assume, and therefore maybe it has some influence on the rate of unemployment with the Phillips curve. Can we achieve our targets? Okay. So here I've put on, here's our short-run Phillips curve, and we are assuming here that it is possible. So the idea here is we want to show that it is not possible for the central bank to achieve its targets. So for this proof, we are assuming the opposite. We are assuming that it is possible to achieve your targets, and then we're going to show a contradiction. Okay, people understand the mathematical, we're not going to do math, but it's a general logic proposition. We're going to say, suppose this ridiculous thing is true, and then show that's ridiculous. Aha, it's a ridiculous thing. That's our framework here. So we're assuming that it is possible to achieve our targets. So here's the natural rate of unemployment. Here's our target rate of unemployment, less than the natural rate. And here's our target level of inflation. Assuming this is true, assuming everyone in this economy thinks this is true, it's just not going to like me today. Yeah. Okay. Everyone thinks this is true, then they think we're going to achieve our target rate of inflation. And since they have control of inflation, it seems reasonable that they could achieve their target level of inflation. So everyone expects the target level of inflation, which gives us a short-run Phillips curve going at the target level of inflation, going through the natural rate of unemployment. We get the short-run Phillips curve like this, right? This is just our expectations, given that we are assuming this ridiculous thing is true, that they can achieve both their goals. I haven't shown you that it's ridiculous. This is the point to show that it's ridiculous. Okay, so what happens then? Well, given that this is the short-run Phillips curve, the central bank could, if it wanted, choose any rate of inflation it wants. right? Because this was all based on expectations. People did their negotiations for their wages. Now their wages are fixed in these short-term contracts. And now this Phillips curve is there. It's an actual thing. And so if the central bank wants to have low inflation, they will have high unemployment. If they want to have high inflation, they will have low unemployment. And they get to pick any level of inflation they want in our little story. Okay. So which level of inflation would they pick? Well, they could, if they wanted to, achieve their target level of inflation just by picking that level of inflation. Okay. If they did, however, they would get the target level of inflation. They would get the natural rate of unemployment. But that would mean that they're very far off of their target for unemployment. And they're right on their target for inflation, right? And we said that the farther off from the target you are, the more you care about that thing. So this central bank is going to be not at all concerned about inflation. Even like a small change in inflation, you're going to feel like, it's not a big deal because we're very close to our target. But they're going to be very super concerned about unemployment because they're way off their unemployment target. The unemployment is way higher than what they want. And so they have an option of moving up this curve. And by moving up this curve, they get a little more inflation and a little less unemployment. But they're really concerned about unemployment. They're not so super concerned about inflation. So this is worth it to them. Okay? So even though they could pick the target level of inflation, they won't do that, right? They will pick some higher level of inflation where the costs of being off from the inflation target are just balanced out by the costs from being off by the unemployment target. Right? They're just going to balance those two things off. You think about marginal cost. You have a marginal cost of being off from the inflation target, marginal cost from being off from the unemployment target, utility costs, and you're just going to balance those two out since you have to move along that line. And you're going to pick the point where those two balance out. If we had indifference curves, which I won't go over today because for lack of time, they would be just tangent here because going in this direction, going to the left is good, going down is good, and so they're kind of upside down indifference curves. They would go to the point where they are just tangent. Okay. Important thing is that we're going to balance off those two costs, and we're going to give you higher inflation than our target level of inflation in order to get closer to our target level of unemployment. Okay. And this, we can argue, is what happened after 1972. They started trying to reduce unemployment, and inflation went up. But of course, if we're thinking about that, well, you fooled me once, but I expected the target level of inflation, and I got a higher level of inflation. Clearly, my expectations were not useful, were not right, and so probably next time I'm not going to expect the target level anymore. I'm going to expect something higher. Right? So this shows that we cannot have an equilibrium, at least in the long run, where we're getting our target level of inflation. We are going to get higher than the target level of inflation, even though it's something that's totally under their control. They can control inflation, but because they have these other desires, these unemployment desires, as good people, they're going to give us higher inflation than their target. So what we end up in equilibrium, if we think about what does long-run equilibrium have to look like, well, it has to be the case that in the long run, just like in our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, in the long run, we've got to be getting the inflation that we expect, right? Because otherwise we're going to change our expectations. We can get fooled once, twice, 100 times, but eventually, even human beings will cop on and learn. So eventually, in the very, very long run, we have to be getting the inflation we expect, okay? Which means we have to be at the natural rate of unemployment. Right? Because if you're getting the inflation you expect, you're going to be at the natural rate of unemployment. But we saw from the previous graph that it cannot be with this low level of inflation. Right? It can't be at point A because then you'd have this incentive to lower unemployment, because that's what you really care about, because you're very far off your target, in order to accept a little bit higher inflation. So it has to be the case that we're at the natural rate of unemployment, but it's got to be the case that there's no incentive for the central bank to change its behavior either, right? So there's no incentive for it to either increase or decrease the rate of inflation, which means the cost of increasing the rate of inflation have to be just balanced out by the benefits of reducing unemployment. Because otherwise you would change your inflation rate if the costs and benefits didn't balance out, right? And since we're at the natural rate of unemployment, the benefits of reducing unemployment are known. We have this big difference from our target, and so there's a big benefit to reducing unemployment. That has to be balanced off with the cost of raising inflation. So it must be that we have a big difference between our target rate of inflation and the inflation that we're getting. Okay? And so we're going to get an equilibrium where inflation is higher than the target level of inflation, unemployment is higher than the target rate of unemployment, and those costs just balance each other out, and we're getting the natural rate of unemployment. Okay? And so this difference here is called the inflation bias. It's an inflation bias from having the ability to pick the money supply. Right? So one thing we could do is we could set up our central banks and just give them the rule that you're going to increase the money supply by 2% every year. Come hell or high water, you're going to increase it by 2% per year, where 2% is the target level of inflation. Right? And we could do that and have them have no discretion whatsoever. This is just the rule. You implement it. You're a technocrat. You do as you're told. Go in there, increase the money supply by 2%. In which case, we would be at this sort of situation, right? That is, we told them they have to increase it by 2%. They're increasing it by 2%, and we're getting the natural rate of unemployment. Now, they would like to increase the inflation rate and lower unemployment, but they got this stupid rule, so they can't have it. They have no discretion on their policy whatsoever. And so this is entirely achievable. It's entirely possible for us to get to point A if we just give the central bank no discretion whatsoever. Right? This is not good. What we don't do is photograph students. That's not a thing. All right. So this would be possible if we set up our central banks in a different way. This is not, by and large, how we set up our central banks. Normally, we set up our central banks so that they can choose any money supply that they want, so they have discretion over how much inflation they're going to give us. In which case, we end up in a situation like this. We get this inflation bias due to having them have discretionary policy. The fact that we allow them to pick any money supply they want means that we're going to get this extra inflation. And we get nothing for it. Right? We're still getting the natural rate of unemployment. We're getting the same unemployment that we had at point A before, but now we are having higher inflation, okay? Just because we gave them discretion. Okay? Now, there's ways that we can try to reduce this inflation bias, but whatever we do, it's still going to be there. We're going to get extra inflation because we give these guys discretion. On the plus side, they can use monetary policy to try to affect the world we live in, right? They can try to reduce unemployment. They can try to smooth out shocks. They can try to spur investment. So this discretionary policy must have some benefit, has some benefits in terms of flexibility to react to changing conditions, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is, well, two costs. One, a policymaker just might go nuts and do crazy things, because humans are like that. And two, we're going to get this inflation bias, even if they're doing everything properly, right? And they're good, and they're nice, and they're smart, and they're clever, and all hardworking, all that good stuff. We're going to get the inflation bias. Okay. One other thing to say about this is that this is, I don't know what you had in micro, but this is, for a lot of you, probably one of your first introductions to game theory. And so game theory is sort of a different, is it like, have you guys had game theory? Did you have Nash equilibrium? Nash equilibrium seeing people? Some, okay. So game theory, Nash equilibrium is sort of a different way than supply and demand to think about things. Supply and demand is magic line going up, magic line going across, magic point where they cross, all of that. That's based on everyone being very small. So that I, in that kind of market, am too small to affect the price as a firm or as a consumer, and so I just take that price as given. Okay? And we can analyze that with the kind of graphs that you've seen so far. Lots of situations, though, have a situation where the entities aren't too small to affect things. Right? A firm might be very large and be not a monopolist, but large enough to affect the market as a whole. When you think about Microsoft, they're not the only one that makes operating systems, but they sure have some say on what goes on in the operating system market, right? It's not like they're just totally sitting there and waiting to see what the market does to, they're a mover in the market, right? And so when you have situations where firms or consumers or somebody in the market is large enough to affect the output or to affect things so that it's not a matter of, I just look at the market and see what happens, but I'm wondering what you are up to personally. Like, Apple is concerned what Microsoft is up to in particular, not just what's going on in the market, but what is Microsoft doing? And Microsoft's concerned about what is Apple doing because they're big compared to the market. Right? In these situations, we normally use game theory to analyze them. And this is one particular one. We're looking for what's called a Nash equilibrium. That's where I'm doing the best I can given the circumstances that we're in. You're doing the best you can given the circumstances that you're in. But we're taking each other into account. Okay, that's it for this. If you want to see how indifference curves go into that, the rest of the slides have a bunch of indifference curve stuff. You can look through it to see. There's not too much, but in case you want to look a little deeper, the rest of the slides have that. Yeah, so that's it for this semester. On Friday, we will have review sessions, so please bring your questions. If you get a chance to review me on the thing, that would be very helpful and nice, and review the course, that would be lovely. Anything else to say? I will see you on Friday.